All right, we're on to chapter 8 now, securing the nation. And it's kind of a funny word, right? Securing the nation. What does Foner mean by that? And really what this whole chapter is about is, as you sort of think about the big picture here, I want you to think about that word, securing the nation. I mean, we've talked about all the build up to the revolution and fighting the war, creating the nation, right? And then all the problems with the Articles of Confederation and how we had to kind of start over again with the Constitution and create this nation. But the decades after the Constitution is ratified, the 2 decades after the Constitution is ratified, are really, really important because this is when we secure the nation. This is when the nation goes from being a fledgling experiment to an actual solid nation that's not going to fall apart. There's an old story about a woman who sees Ben Franklin after he's coming out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and she says, "So, Mr. Franklin, what do we have? A republic or a monarchy?" And he looks at her and he says, "Well, it's a republic, if you can keep it. If you can keep it, right? That's always been the big question in this American experiment. If we can keep it, can we figure out a way to make this democratic republic work?" And that's what this chapter is all about, is this first generation of leaders moving from being revolutionary leaders, where you're fighting a war, to becoming leaders of a nation, of a sustainable nation. And it's interesting because this is one of the things that really distinguishes the United States as a nation from many other nations around the world. I mean, you think about a lot of the democracies that have or revolutions that have happened in the world, and how few of them have actually become democracies over time. Because what happens is that the revolutionary leaders, the people who overthrow the previous government, then manage to somehow to take all that power in themselves, right? And they become despots themselves. I mean, we see this all over the world, from Russia to Sierra Leone and Liberia to even to some extent to France and some of the other European nations. And America is able to avoid this, and in large part it's due to what happens in these first 2 decades. And that's why it's really important to think about and understand these first 2 decades after the Constitution. So, you've read the chapter. If you haven't, go back and read it. And I'm just going to highlight a few things here that really emphasize this point about the precedents that are being set in these first 2 decades. And to talk also about the 1790s, the age of passion, right? When politics was a lot more brutal and a lot more personal than it is now. I mean, as polarized as the Democrats and Republicans are in the early 21st century, they have nothing on the Federalists and the Republicans of the 1790s. And so I want to talk a little about that, because this is really when you get the first creation, the creation of the first parties in American history. I mean, George Washington had no party, and he didn't want to have a party. He didn't believe in parties, and a lot of people agreed with him. They saw parties as being corrupting or divisive and corrosive in politics. They don't want to have parties. I mean, you hear a lot of this rhetoric now. There was something called the No Labels movement last year, which sought to bring Democrats and Republicans together and create this new movement called the No Labels, No Parties movement of just common sense Americans. And the problem with that is that people have very different ideas of what freedom means, right? And in a democracy, those ideas are gonna compete and for popularity. They're gonna fight, in the marketplace of ideas, right? And that's kind of the idea behind a democracy, is that there is no one way of thinking. We're not a monolith. We have many different ideas, and this starts to become very evident right away after the Constitution is ratified. You get George Washington. He's a unique figure, right? He's the father of the nation. He is overwhelmingly popular. He runs unopposed for president. wins, obviously, and is supported even when people disagree. But what happens is within his cabinet are the seeds of the two different parties that are going to grow. One is embodied in Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, the other in Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and they have very different visions of freedom. And Foner analyzes this, and I urge you to reread those sections. Hamilton is, he's a brilliant, he's the son of a slave owner from Barbados, and he's just one of these amazing men who has a brilliant mind. He's one of the first anti-slavery advocates in the nation, but he has a very distinctive understanding of what freedom and America should mean. For one thing, he has a vision of the United States as being this worldwide commercial empire, where trade is central to this idea. Finance is central to this idea. That basically he wants the United States to become a non-monarchical version of Great Britain. So the people who ally with him become. These are the Federalists, very different from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists from the decade before. But the Federalists believe in a very strong, very vigorous, energetic national government that would help lay the foundation for a grand commercial empire. He believes, and the Federalists believe, in a very loose construction of the Constitution. This is really important, the idea of a loose construction of the Constitution. The Constitution is very short, as we saw last week. And for Hamilton and the loose constructionists, the Federalist Party, they don't want the Constitution to be a straitjacket, right? They don't want to be bound by the restrictions of the Constitution. They don't want to be bound by this idea that says, well, if it's not expressly written in the Constitution, you can't do it. Because their point would be this: we don't know what the world's going to hold for us, right? We don't know what America's going to need to do in the future. If we want to be this growing commercial empire, we need to be able to do whatever circumstances dictate that we need to do. And they seize upon that clause, that necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, and they say, if something is necessary and proper, the national government should be able to do it. And this is fundamentally different than the Republicans' approach. Republican Party grows out of the ideas of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others who, after the Constitution is ratified, start to step back a little bit from their support of a strong national government. They're a little worried that the government's going to be too strong. They see what's going on with Hamilton and the Federalists, and they fear that that's going to inhibit liberty in the future. That's going to be too dangerous, because you're going to get this too powerful federal government that's going to do too much and interfere too much with everyday life. And Jefferson has a great line that the government that governs best governs least, right? That we only need as much government as is absolutely necessary to do the tasks that we can't do on our own as individuals. In the Jeffersonian vision, the Republican vision, and this is a very different Republican Party than the current Republican Party, right? The current Republican Party does not trace its roots down to Jefferson. The current Republican Party traces its roots down to the 1850s. It's an anti-slavery party that grows in the 1850s. Abraham Lincoln is the first elected Republican president. This is a very different party. So again, even though the words are the same, keep them separate in your mind. The Republicans of Thomas Jefferson's era believe in an empire of liberty that's built on independent landowning farmers. They believed that owning your own land, producing your own goods, this was virtue. This was how you create a virtuous citizen. This was how you create a free citizen. They didn't trust the urban folks. They didn't trust the financiers and the merchants and the traders, right? They didn't see that as being the cradle of liberty. They saw the family farms being the cradle of liberty. And so they were oriented westward. as opposed to looking back at England and the old world. I mean, they were sympathetic to France in the France-England rivalry, but really they saw the West as being where they wanted the America to grow and focus its energies. And so for Jefferson, the Constitution was a straitjacket. It was kind of a limiting document. It was intended to be a limiting document in his mind and for the Republicans. If it was not in the Constitution, the government shouldn't do it. That's their basic line. That was called strict constructionism, right? They read the Constitution strictly and said, if it's not specifically in the document, the federal government must not do it. And so this is the major division of the parties in the 1790s, the Federalists and the Republicans. And this is a tremendously passionate time. You might say, well, why? I mean, we just fought this war. We won. We created this Constitution. It's been ratified. This should be a heady time, an exciting time when people come together and unite behind the new nation. And that is true. But at the same time, you've got people who are very worried about preserving the legacy of that revolution and securing the future of this nation. Right? The very survival of the nation is at stake. The very survival of freedom is at stake. And so people take their politics very passionate. They're very passionate about their politics. They take it very personally. The rhetoric that is thrown about against Jefferson and against John Adams, against the leading public figures of this time, it's extraordinary. I mean, nobody would get away with it today. I mean, even the worst of the blogs, even Rush Limbaugh and some of the folks who are most extreme in their rhetoric today, they don't qualify. They would be bush leaguers compared to these folks in the 1790s who got very, very angry about this. They thought when John Adams ran for president, I mean, they thought people thought he was going to create a new monarchy because they felt he was so tied. He was a Federalist. John Adams was a Federalist, and people thought he was so tied to these ideas of hierarchy that they couldn't imagine him being a reasonable head of the government. And it's true. I mean, Federalists and Republicans just had very, very different ideas about what freedom was. For the Federalists, they did have monarchical tendencies in the sense of seeing society and seeing the ideal of society as being hierarchical, where there are different levels of people, and that politics and governing should be the realm of the elite, which tend to be the wealthy, the powerful, the merchant class, and so forth, the elite. Whereas the Republicans tended to see the ideal as being the yeoman farmers, right? Having this broad base of equality and letting those people make the decisions that govern society. So because you have such clashing visions, you're going to get a very passionate, tumultuous time in politics. So I want to talk about those would be the first two questions for your homework. The first question is, describe the vision of freedom expressed by the Federalists. Who supported them and why? And then question number 2 would be the same thing for the Republicans. Describe the vision of freedom expressed by the Republicans. Who supported them and why? Because these two parties are the first two parties in American history. And a lot of their arguments actually resonate today. And we hear echoes of them today. This argument between strict constructionism on the one hand and loose constructionism on the other is one that we still hear today. So people were very, very interested in politics at this time. They understood, especially the leadership class kind of understood that the decisions they made now and the battles that they were fighting now were going to set precedents that were going to last for a long time. And they truly did. Right, and you see this with the selection of the capital city. Right, Foner talks a bit about that in the book. How there's again, it's an early clash. This is 1790, so this is early in the clash before the parties have really taken shape. But you get Jefferson and Hamilton on opposite sides of a fight. and they come together. In this case, it's about the debt. Part of Hamilton's plan is that he thinks that the national government should assume all the state debts that were incurred during the Revolution and afterward. And for Jefferson and many others, they worry that this is going to lead not only to excessive centralized power, but it's also just morally wrong, because what would then happen is that the federal government would be enriching these speculators who bought up all these bonds, often from dirt poor Revolutionary War soldiers who'd been given them as part of their pay, and then had to sell them at cut rate prices during the hard times of the 1780s. And they sold them to speculators and financiers who now hold these bonds. Well, if the federal government's going to assume control and pay back these debts in full, those speculators are going to be enriched. So Jefferson and many folks in the South, in particular, because many Southern states didn't have large debts to pay back, and they objected to this plan. And on Hamilton's side, what they were looking for not only was an assumption of the debt, but they wanted to place the capital of the nation, which was temporarily now being housed in New York. They wanted to place the capital of the nation in a major city like New York or Philadelphia or Boston. Southerners couldn't abide that. They were worried already. They're worried about slavery. And already, because Philadelphia in particular is becoming a locus of anti-slavery sentiment, New York is as well. I mean, Alexander Hamilton himself is anti-slavery. And so they come together and create this deal, which is going to have long-term consequences. The deal is the South will support Hamilton's plan on debt if Hamilton and the Northerners support putting a capital in the South, right? And so that's what they do. They create this city out of what's really just plantation country, and it's in the heart of the South, right? It's between two of the largest slave states in the country, and this is going to have significant implications years down the road. So what happens in the 1790s has lasting consequences. I mean, we see this with George Washington. I think I may have mentioned before, I think George Washington is actually underrated as a president in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I think he's underrated for is what he didn't do. He didn't stay in office. After 2 terms, he stepped down. He wanted to set a precedent of a president stepping away from power. He did not want to become a monarch. He did not want to be tempted by the powers of a monarch. He wanted to set the example to say, look, if I, George Washington, leader of the Continental Army, father of the nation, if I am not willing or able to stay on for more than 2 terms or to amass this kind of power, who is, right? And by stepping down, he sets the precedent for 2 term, of a 2-term president that lasts all the way up until the 1930s, until Franklin Roosevelt decides, hey, why not run for a 3rd term? And well, that's a story for another day. And John Adams also comes and sets a powerful precedent. When he runs for re-election, he wants to win in 1800. So he wins the presidency in 1796. 4 years later, you have this very volatile political campaign. He winds up losing. And the reason why it's called, in some ways, the Revolution of 1800, the reason why this is so important is not only because it's a transfer of power and the Republicans win and sort of consolidate power on their own, but it's that peaceful transfer of power from one party to another. This is huge. A lot of countries in the world that have had revolutions never get to this point where one party can peacefully transfer power to its opposition, right? I mean, you see it across the Middle East, in Egypt and Libya and other places where people are struggling to figure out how to transfer this power. And so this precedent is really, really important. You have other precedents being set in other ways, like with John Marshall and the Supreme Court. John Marshall is an extraordinary figure. I mean, there's just a little bit on him in this section, but he's a Federalist, but he's also a believer in the institution of the Supreme Court. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but the Supreme Court was terribly weak. Of the three branches of government, everybody thought the Supreme Court was the weakest one. I mean, you had people refusing appointments, saying, I don't want to be appointed to that. I mean, there's no power there, right? I mean, the executive branch and the legislative branch, those powers were understood, but the judicial branch didn't seem to have the same kind of power that the other branches had. But John Marshall takes over as Chief Justice, and he really seeks to strengthen the Supreme Court as an institution. And you have a couple of cases here in the early 1800s where he does just that. And it's over this issue of judicial review. Who gets to decide what a law means or whether a law is constitutional or not, right? Congress passes the law. The executive branch is supposed to enforce the law. The judicial branch is supposed to interpret the law. And what does that mean? Well, for John Marshall, it means that the Supreme Court has to have the power of judicial review. It has to be able to review the constitutionality of laws that are passed by Congress. And he asserts this power in a very deft way in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, where he actually supports the Republican president. Remember, he's a Federalist, so he actually supports the Republican president's position, but he does so by asserting the power of judicial review. And so Jefferson is kind of in a bind, right? He's like, well, wait a minute, I support this decision. I don't know if I support judicial review, right? If I want to give the Supreme Court that much power, but he can't do anything but accept it. And so what John Marshall is able to do here is he's able to claim a power for the court that's really, really important. And it's what the court does now, right? I mean, for 200 years. And he does that in Marbury versus Madison with the federal government. And then in 1810, he does it again in Fletcher v. Peck with state laws, where he has a state law that comes up for review, and he asserts that power of judicial review. And so what John Marshall, during the course of his term, he was Chief Justice for more than 30 years, he basically is able to raise the stature and power of the Supreme Court so that the judicial branch is on par with the other two branches. And this is really important. You have other precedents, right, that happen. I mean, basically everything that's being done is establishing a precedent of some kind or another. It's interesting with Jefferson, because Jefferson gets elected in 1800, comes in as a Republican, and he comes in as a strict constructionist, right? He believes that the Constitution says what it says, and the federal government has to abide by that and no more. But he also believes in this empire of liberty, right, where he believes the nation's virtue depends on having virtuous landowning yeoman farmers tilling the land. Well, in order to do that, he needs to have lots of land. And he gets this tremendous opportunity when Napoleon comes to him and basically says, I'm going to sell you the Louisiana Territory. I don't really care about the territory anymore. Napoleon's worried about his rivalry with England and his battles back in Europe. And so he's thinking he'll sell all this land in North America he doesn't want, get cash, which he can then use for his battles back home. But this presents a dilemma for Jefferson, right? Because on the one hand, he wants more land, because more land would mean that the nation could continue to expand westward. You'd have basically a seemingly endless supply of land for future family farms, which would then support the yeoman farmers who would become the bedrock of virtue for the American nation. The problem is, he's not supposed to believe in buying this territory, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says he can, right? It says nothing about the federal government having the authority to purchase land from foreign powers without congressional consent or without anything. I mean, he doesn't have the power, the constitutional power. And so Jefferson, the strict constructionist, becomes a very loose constructionist and says, you know what? This is necessary and proper. This is for the good of the nation. I'm the president. I'm going to decide to do this anyway. And he does. I mean, in the end, it's really important for the United States. It's it's one of the hallmarks of his administration, but it's in breaking his principle that he's able to create this long lasting, enduring change. I mean, we see this a lot, where parties or people will hold one set of principles when they're out of power in opposition, and then when they get in power, they suddenly realize, they say, "Wow, I want to assert as much power as I possibly can." You see this in the executive branch a lot. So the nation is trying to assert itself, trying to secure the liberty for its people. It's also trying to assert itself as a nation on the world stage, right? Because it's a small country. It doesn't have a big navy or army, right? What's going to stop Britain or France or other countries from taking advantage of it? And so what you see in the decades after the American Revolution is that the United States trying to consolidate its victory, right? And because its status as a nation is still uncertain, right? We don't really know it. Nobody really knows how long this nation is going to last. And so you see this, Jefferson tries to assert himself and assert American interests with the British. It doesn't work so well because the British still are more powerful. Even though we won the war, the British are still much more powerful, and they're able to impress our soldiers, right? Basically arrest and force them into the Royal Navy. But every time the United States tries to do something about it, it fails. We try embargoes; they don't really work very well, and they wind up, in a sense, precipitating this war, what was sometimes called the Second American Revolution, the War of 1812, where Congress, again, America is trying to get Britain to allow for free trade, stop impressing our soldiers, stop interfering, but it doesn't. And so the United States has to say, well, are we going to do something about it? And James Madison, who's now president, does. And it's really tough fighting. And in the end, we only win a stalemate. But that stalemate is tremendously important because basically what we've done is shown Britain that we can hold our own. We're not going to win the war. We didn't win many concessions or anything, but we kept them out, as we kept them out in the 1770s and early 1780s. And this is really important for establishing the credibility of the United States as a nation. I'm going to stop there. The next video is going to be about the primary source documents, and we'll talk more about slavery, and the role of slavery and the role of women in class.